So I have the top board centered on the bottom board and flush on the top. So that means since this is 24 inches wide, I've got 3-inch overhang here on the bottom board and 3 inches of the overhang here. I just set my combination square to 3 inches and made sure that it's centered and flush. So since we know that we're referencing this and we only have 6 inches to work with, we're ignoring this bottom 1/8 of an inch essentially. With the combination square still set to 3 inches, I'm going to come over here and just draw a line on both sides. And 2 3/4 is what I'm going to set my combination square to next. Just come over here, and that's going to be the spot that we drill. And again, I'm going to be using a 5/8 of an inch Forstner bit at the drill press. Now, the way that I have my drill press set up, I can actually drill these two boards almost all the way through, clamped together. So that means I don't have to drill these separate. But if you did have to drill them separate, what you could do is drill all the way through the front board, come back here, flush them back up again, take your Forstner bit, stick it in the hole because the Forstner bit has a point on it, stick it through the hole, give it a good tap, and then you'll know exactly where you need to drill on the bottom board. But what I'm going to do is clamp these two together and drill them at once. About 90% of the way through the bottom board, but all the way through the top board. And I'm making sure to double check that everything is flush on the top. And again, making sure that I'm still flush before I clamp this down. So there's my mark, and what I'm going to do is just take my time, keep pulling it out, letting it clear out. So again, this is a 5/8 of an inch Forstner bit, and here we go. And that's about as far as I can go. So let me remove these clamps and then finish drilling through the bottom board. So now I got my holes lined back up. I'm going to go ahead and drill all the way through this. There's one more thing we need to do to this front vise before we go ahead and move forward with mortising the rear vise. And we need to elongate the holes so that way the front vise can rack a little bit when you're putting the boards in there. You want to make sure that when you elongate the holes, you go across its length and not the width. You don't want any slop going up and down with the threaded rod. You only want it from side to side, not across the width. So when you make any adjustments or drill out any of this stuff at the drill press, you want to leave the 5/8 of an inch, I guess, width alone. You want to leave that alone. You just want to make sure that it's elongated across the length of the board, not the width. So what I'm going to do is take my combination square and line it up, and I'm going to take off or elongate the hole 1/8 of an inch on each side. So then what I'm going to do is just bring it in, draw my lines, and then I'm also, just to make sure that my drill bit is not off and it's not going to make this part over here any higher or lower than the actual hole, I'm going to take my pencil and just scribe a line on both sides of the hole. So that way I know that if the bit is even remotely close to going beyond either one of these two lines, then I know that that's not where I want to drill, and I need to set my drill up a little bit better. So I'm out here at the drill press, and I've set up an auxiliary fence that I've clamped to my table. And what that's going to do is I can butt this board up against it and know that it's perfectly in line. So theoretically, all that I would need to do is just shift this over a little bit and line it up with these lines and drill. And then you'll notice that when I have the bit turned, it doesn't it doesn't come in contact beyond that bottom line that I scribed on my hole. Now you're going to want to make sure to hold your board down because actually I'm going to clamp mine down because the Forstner bit will want to rack a little bit. So I'm going to clamp my board down to hold it still. So here we go. So as you can see, it's elongated and it stayed within my lines. So I know that the 5/8 of an inch rod is not going to rack up and down. It's only going to move side to side. And so we got plenty of movement across, but no movement, or just, not much up and down. So that'll be nice and tight, and it'll stay referenced to the top of the rear vise piece. Plenty of movement. So now I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing on the other hole. So the next thing we're going to do is mortise in the steel plate on the back of the vise. And I've already gone ahead and done this side to show you what it looks like. It's pretty simple. We're just going to mark it out with our marking knife, and then I'm going to use a router plane and a chisel to remove the waste. I've gone ahead and done this, and I've got a piece of blue tape with the arrow to let me know that this goes with this side and this is the orientation, just in case it doesn't fit this way. As you can see, it's not exactly square. So when you get these marked, be sure to put some sort of blue tape or some markings to remember which way you mark this with your marking knife. The first thing we're going to do is use a countersink bit to enlarge that hole a little bit, because the welding on this will actually keep this above the surface just a little bit, so that when you put this through to use your marking knife, it's not going to be seated. So what we're going to do is just use a countersink bit and make this a little bit larger. And that's seated good enough. Put one of the wing nut assemblies on. And then using a combination square, we want to seat these vertically on the board. You want to make sure it's square, and I got lucky the first time. So I'm going to clamp this into place to make sure that this doesn't move at all. And then I'm going to use a marking knife and mark the surface of the steel plate. And we can remove the rod, and this is the area that we will need to mortise out. I actually forgot, I'm going to stick this back in here and put some blue tape just so I know the orientation. Put a 2 on it and an arrow. I'm going to go ahead and clamp this piece to my workbench so that way when I chisel it, it doesn't move. And then just using my chisel, I'm using a 3/4 inch chisel. I'm going to go around the perimeter and just make it a little bit deeper. And I'm referencing my scribe lines. All right, so now what I'm pretty much going to do is just take a little bit out of the perimeter and then use my router planes to take out the rest. But obviously you don't want to just take your router plane and start with it, because there's a good chance that you can blow out this edge. So I just like to go ahead and use my chisel and remove some of it. You could also just use a power planer and a straight bit to remove a majority of this too, and then come back and clean it up with the chisel. And just for the positioning of the camera, I'm going to leave it in, just lean over my bench and remove some from this area. Because it's easier to do this than it is to move the camera around. Now that we got the little island in the middle and we've removed some around the sides, I'm going to go ahead and put the chisel, put the bevel down, and just remove some of this little island in the center before I switch over to the router plane. Switch ends, come back this way. And now I'm going to switch over to my small router plane, and I have this depth stop set to the thickness of the steel plate. It's roughly 1/8 of an inch. So I'm going to zero it out on the surface. And I'm cutting with this with the grain. I'm not going this way because that would be cutting across the grain, and it's just a little bit easier. And just tap it down a little bit. We don't want to take off a whole lot at once with this little plane. And it's pretty much just keep tapping this down lower and lower until you bottom out on your depth gauge. Fits pretty good in there, so what I'm going to go ahead and do now is countersink this hole again because the welds come to a taper here on the end and it won't seat properly like before, so I'm just going to use my countersink bit. Got my number 2 reference line. Actually got the tape on the side, so it's holding it out. I think the welds on this side are a little bit thicker, so that's what's holding me out. So I'm just going to use my gouge here again. And there we go. And they're perfect. And we're nice and square. So we're good to go. Pre-drilling for the screws is pretty simple. I've got an 1/8 inch drill bit into my drill, and I've got a piece of blue tape to let me know where I need to stop. And so I'm just going to put it on the center of this hole. So guys, technically we have a working Moxon vise. We have the hardware attached to the rear vise piece and the holes cut, so we technically could use this right now. But of course, we're not done with it just yet. We're going to be styling the front vise piece and the rear vise piece to make it look better and function a little bit better and make it easier to clamp to your workbench. So for now, even though we just spent the time to get all that stuff mortised out and screwed in, let's go ahead and remove that hardware and start working on styling the front vise piece. Over on the website, I'll have 2 additional PDF files that are the templates for the curves on the front and the rear vise piece. You just want to print these to scale and then just cut them out following the lines that are on the template. This is the same 6 inches wide piece that goes on the rear vise and the 6 1/8. And what they're going to do is allow you to have the exact curves and radiuses that I used on the SketchUp file. And what I'm going to do is spray some Super 77 on here and glue it to a piece of plywood and then cut the plywood out. That way I can use it as a template on both sides of the vise pieces to make sure that they both are exactly the same. I'm going to spray some Super 77 on both the template and the plywood. And this is the stuff that I use. And I'm going to let that tack up for a few minutes before I put it on. I think we're ready now. So when we put these on, it's pretty important to make sure that you line up the bottom and the front edge with your plywood. That way it stays nice and square. Next up, I take the pieces over to the bandsaw, removing the waste. I make sure to stay roughly 1/8 of an inch away from my line. And to clean up the edges, I use my spindle sander and disc sander. And that's all it took. So now we can go ahead and trace these out on our actual pieces. Before I actually mark anything and do any cutting, I put the rods back in place just to make sure that I'm referencing the boards the right way and that this is the bottom and this is the top. Because even though we have these marked just perfect, you're going to find that one way fits better than the other as far as the overhang. And there's my mark. So what I'm going to do is take this and just flip it over and put it on the other end and mark. And then it's back to the bandsaw again to remove the waste. It's extremely important to stay away from your line roughly 1/8 of an inch. And then we'll use the spindle sander and the disc sander again to take it down. And this is at the part where Sean forgot to turn his microphone on, and I'm guessing what he is saying is I'm using these sanding contours and some 120 grit sandpaper to clean up the areas that I just used the disc sander and the spindle sander on. So I'm putting some denatured alcohol on this after I sand it just to see what it looks like. I'm not worried about glue squeeze out from gluing these together. I'm just more concerned about if there's any scratch marks left that I want to remove, because this cherry turns really chalky and it's hard to see. This side looks good, so I'm going to repeat the same thing on the other side. Okay, and the final piece of the design is I've got a chamfer bit here in the router table, and I've got it to where it's not going to cut a whole lot in this first pass, and I'm going to slowly keep raising it until I get to my final size. And to make my passes, I'm going to start with the ends of the boards on the end grain. That way if there's any tear out along this grain here, the router bit will remove that. So I'm going to do the 2 ends first, and then come back and do the edges. After the first run, I turned the router off, raised the bit roughly 1/8 of an inch, and now I'm making the second pass. So the final piece is to glue the leather on the back of the front vise piece. You have an option, you can, or a choice rather, you can leave the smooth side out or the rough side out. I'm going to leave the rough side out just to give it more grip. But since we've elongated these holes, the leather is just a little too long. It's actually 1/2 inch too wide, so I'll just take a 1/2 inch off. So to cut this, I'm going to mark it at a little under 17.5. I'm going to do 17 3/8. And again, this doesn't have to be perfect. And mark it again at the bottom at 17 3/8. But again, you need to measure what you were working with in case you made your holes a little bit longer. Just go off of your measurements. And then with the blade, with the leather cutting, you want to make light passes and gradually get deeper and deeper. That way you don't come off of the cut and cut your finger or go off of your line. So just make light passes. There you go. So we have another decision here. And the piece of leather we have is 6 inches wide, but we made our front vise 6 1/8. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to flush it up with the top or the bottom, just in case I ever need to rework it and take some off the top or the bottom. I'm just going to center it on the inside of the vise. And to glue it into place, I'm just going to use some Titebond hide glue to hold it into place. It doesn't require any special type of glue. You can use contact cement, but Titebond hide glue or regular yellow glue will work just perfect. All right, so now it's just a matter of placing it on your board and slide it over in position, centering it between the holes, and then centering it across its width so that way it's not touching the bottom or the top. So you can, if you have to plane away some of it because it's not flush, you've got a little room. And now I'm going to let this set completely overnight for the glue to cure. I've got the leather out of the clamps now. It's been roughly 24 hours, and I'm going to go ahead and clean up this chamfer a little bit with my block plane. I had a few little ridges in there from where I must have moved it during the planing or the routing process. So I'm just going to remove a little bit from it and clean it up. That's good. I pulled out the number 3 and cleaned up the edges on the rear vise and the front vise. On the top of the front vise I had some pretty gnarly grain, so I switched over to my low angle jack to clean that up. And finally, I sanded the faces of the front and the rear vise piece just using some 120 grit sandpaper. I didn't feel the need to go any higher because it left the surface with a pretty nice look, and you definitely don't want to go any higher on the inside of the rear vise. And then just using some 180 grit sandpaper, I'm going to relieve the edges just so they're not so sharp. And finally, we're going to move on to the finishing portion of this video. And if you're going to be adding the benchtop solution, you can wait until you build the top and attach it before putting any finish on it. I'm just going to be showing how to finish it here in case you guys don't want to add the benchtop. You can see what I would typically do. I have a 2-pound cut of a blonde shellac that I'm going to be applying just using a cotton rag. And the key with the vise, this is the inside of the rear vise piece. You don't want a slick finish on this because it's going to be holding your work. So what I'm probably going to be doing is from the inside of the holes here is probably just put 1, maybe 2 coats, and I'm not going to sand between coats because if it's a rough finish, that's what I want. I want it to hold the piece. But from the left side of the bolt holes out, I'm actually going to put 2 to 3 coats on it just to give it a little bit more sheen because you're going to see that when you're looking at the vise. And the rear, I'll just probably put 2 coats because you probably won't even see it. On the front vise piece and on the inside, I'm probably going to put 3 coats on it, and of course not getting any on the leather. So because the leather is what's going to be holding the work, so you can put a couple 3 coats to build up a nice look. So now I'm going to dip it in here, get it on here, and then just apply it. just looks great. I'm not too concerned about this knot hole here. I kind of like the way it looks, so I didn't fill it with epoxy. Again, I'm going to try and not get any on the leather. Now when I go ahead and glue my bench top on here, I'm going to sand the shellac off where the vise or where the bench top will be glued. But I'm just, for the purposes of this video, in case, like I was mentioning earlier, you stop at this and don't do the bench top, I just wanted to show you how I would do it. And I'll probably let this dry for 30 minutes to an hour, and then come back and repeat this a couple more times on the front, one more time on this rear vise. The shellac finish is dried, and let me go ahead and show you how to use this Moxon vise real quick. I've got the hardware mounted back in it with the wing nut assemblies, and I've got the heavy washers in front of the wing nut assemblies. So the first thing you typically do is you set this on the workbench, and this 1/8 of an inch lip from this front vise piece being wider will reference and push against the ledge of your workbench. And when that touches, you know that this rear vise piece is flush. So I'm going to take a clamp and clamp them into place. And then on this side, I'm just going to use a parallel clamp because I have drawers and I can't access this part of the workbench. And so now that it's clamped on the workbench, I'm going to move the camera a little bit closer to show you how to operate it. So let me show you how you would typically use a Moxon vise. I've got a nice quilted maple board that I want to cut some pretend dovetails in. So put it in the vise, bring it all the way over to one rod, and then screw one of the wing nut assemblies in. You don't want to make it too tight to where you can't move this board, but just screw it in until all of the slack is gone. Bring the board over to the middle of the board, or middle of the clamp, hold it with your hands, and then screw the other wing nut assembly in. And it only takes, once all the slack is off of this, it only takes about 1/4 of a turn before this is extremely tight and it's not going anywhere. So, I mean, that's pretty much how you use this, and it's a one-trick pony, but it's really handy to have because if I were to have the workpiece clamped on the end vise over here, it's going to be way down here. So when I cut, it's going to be sort of an unnatural position, and it's going to be lower and lowering my hand, which either that or I have to bend over, and it just brings the piece up to a more comfortable height. So if I were to cut dovetails, the board would be lower. So now I've got it up here, and it's actually way better, and it's at a more natural position. So I think you're going to find this a really handy tool. And so remember, we also elongated the holes so we can move it around quite a bit easily without having it bind. If you do find that yours is rubbing and it's kind of hard to move, just take a dowel rod with some sandpaper and loosen these holes up just a little bit. But you don't want any movement up and down, as you can see here. You just want it side to side. That way it stays nice and true to your bench top. So that's essentially all there is to the Moxon vise. It's a simple build that you could probably knock out just a basic Moxon vise in a weekend just using some scrap lumber that you have. It's a pretty simple build, and it's a tool that's going to last you a lifetime. If you use the quality hardware like the Texas Heritage, you'll be happy with it, but do your research on the hardware that you want to use. If I had to do it over, I would still choose the Texas Heritage. It's a nice quality kit. The part 2 of this series will be building the bench top accessory, and the bench top will give you an additional 12 inches in width, 24 inches in length, and it'll be great for using to lay your drawer pieces or dovetailed pieces to chisel it out. It just gives you a more comfortable height on working on your pieces. So if you're interested in building that, just stick around. I'll have part 2 out shortly. But if you do build this, be sure to share it here on SimpleCove.com because I'm sure I would be interested in seeing it, and so would others. So I appreciate you guys watching, and I'll see you in the second part of the series.